welcome. Thank you for joining us. We have a lot of sessions to choose from, so thank you very much for choosing this one. Oh, some familiar faces. Hi, people. Some faces I don't know. Hi to you, too. My name's Allison Marcel, and my pronouns are she and her, and I work at the Canadian Observatory on Homelessness. Please forgive me. I'm going to do all of my duties as best I can, but I have some paper bios, I have some handwritten bios, and I have some bios on the app. So I'm going to do my best, but first I'm going to start with a land acknowledgement. The mic isn't working, I'm sorry, but I'll speak louder, and I'll ask the presenters to also speak up, please. Okay. Please come, join us. No, but you know what I heard? That the mics are picking up sound, and they're just going into the auditorium or the main room. Oh, just in case, I'm gonna pretend it works in hope that it realizes it should be working, and starts to work. Yeah, like this is what they do, right? No? Okay. Okay. So I'd like to acknowledge the land we're meeting on is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabeg, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. We also acknowledge that the City of Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. All right, so I'm going to start with Aaron Day and Jason Webb. Aaron Day, D-E-J, but the J is silent, so it's pronounced Day, and when she used to work with us, her nickname was Silent J.
There'll be a quiz after.
Yeah, anyway. Erin is now assistant professor in the Department of Criminology at Wilfrid Laurier University. Her research focuses on the social exclusion of people experiencing homelessness and how to build inclusive communities. Welcome, Erin. Jason Webb, who also used to work with us, and he has two B's at the end of his name. One of them is silent, and his nickname is Silent B.
But the J's not silent.
Jason completed a PhD in sociology from York University and a postdoctoral fellowship at Wilfrid Laurier this year. His research interests include family poverty, homelessness, critical policy analysis, and citizenship. His current research examines how inadequate protections for residential tenants reflect the housing market, contributed to the gendered and racialized construction of urban citizenship in the 21st century. I'm sorry, I read that so terribly that I doubt you understood that. I'm so sorry.
I think I wrote it terribly.
Yeah. Huh. Jessica, should I read yours?
Yes, please.
Mm-hmm.
Jessica Bramo is an assistant professor in the Department of Sociology, Criminology program at York University. Jessica seeks to use her research to better inform how social policy and practice can respond to the lives of marginalized and vulnerable populations. Welcome. You guys will present first. I'll do all the bios now if you don't mind, and then I can just sit for the rest of the presentation. Okay, great. Next, we have Sarah Cullingham. Is a PhD candidate in the Frost Center for Canadian Studies and Indigenous Studies at Trent. She holds a Bachelor of Arts degree in Women's Studies and Environmental Studies from U of Vic and a Master's of Arts Planning degree from UBC. She works as a grad research assistant in the Research for Social Change Lab led by Dr. Naomi Nichols, where she supports the Youth Homelessness Data and Infrastructure Audit project funded by Making the Shift. Her own doctoral research focuses on the social worlds of drugs, in particular the experience of cannabis legalization in the Canadian context. She's funded by SSHRC, a Canada Doctoral Scholarship. In addition to her academic work, Sarah serves on the board of the Electric City Culture Council, EC3, is an active member of the Peterborough Drug Strategy, and a volunteer with Food Not Bombs Peterborough. Now, I'm sorry to say we're all out of time. Thanks. Naomi So Jason never worked with us at the COH. Aaron did. Naomi also did. And Naomi is now an associate professor in sociology and Canada Research Chair in Community Partnered Social Justice at Trent, where she directs the Research for Social Change Lab and the Interdisciplinary Social Research PhD program. Okay, we're almost through here, people. Rebecca Signer. She works at the Research Center at BC Housing. I appreciate your bio. And last, we have, thank you for your patience, everyone. We have Violet Hayes. Violet became the ED of Island Crisis Care Society in Nanaimo, BC in April of 2011. Her focus has been on building the society's capacity, developing new programs, and increasing visibility and awareness of the work of the society and the community. She came to ICCS with more than 25 years' experience working in the social service field. A founding member of the Oceanside Task Force on Homelessness, the committee raised awareness of the homelessness crisis in that community, which led to new programs such as Orca Place in Parksville. Facing huge opposition, Orca Place has proved how, sorry, I'm not laughing at your bio. There's more and it's not letting me scroll. I'm so sorry. And much, much more. Okay. Each group of presenters will have 20 minutes, and we'll have 30 minutes at the end for questions.
I feel like the 20 minutes was the intro.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. Is my voice loud enough for the room? Perfect? Okay, awesome. Those acting classes when I was 7 finally paid off. So thank you, everyone, for coming out this afternoon. We are grateful for the opportunity to talk about our ongoing research project entitled From NIMBY to Neighbor, brokering a dialogue about homelessness, law enforcement, and the community. And today we'd just like to share our research to date. Our research project stems from the idea that if we want to prevent homelessness, we need collective responses and we need to address the distinct challenges of preventing homelessness in mid-sized cities. Next slide, please. So a little bit about us. We are 10 researchers from different academic backgrounds across 4 universities. Our project also has an advisory group, which are made up of representatives from the 3 cities. These are our advisory group are folks with lived experience of homelessness. They lead their own projects and advise the research project both broadly and in detail. Next slide, please. So our project has 3 objectives. Our first objective is bringing together scholars and lived experts to examine how 3 mid-sized cities, Brantford, Cambridge, and Guelph, make sense of homelessness and the strategies they've developed to address homelessness. We looked specifically at mid-sized cities, and these is defined as cities of having a population from 50,000 to 500,000, simply because many of these cities don't have the same capacity and resources to address homelessness in their communities as, say, in large urban centers like Montreal, Toronto, and Vancouver. And I think this is important, excluding the Greater Toronto and Hamilton area. More than 25% of the Ontario population resides in mid-sized cities. And of course, as you probably are well aware, many of these cities are growing. And their growth means homelessness in these communities may also grow as well. So there is a sense of urgency in helping people who are experiencing homelessness in their respective communities. Our second objective is to work with partner communities to understand the issues around homelessness specific to their community and formulate solutions informed by a human rights perspective. Our third objective is to help create opportunities for community partners to cultivate public empathy for people experiencing homelessness in their community and to foster community resilience to homelessness as a preventative measure within their respective community. I'm going to be saying community a lot in this talk, so be prepared for that. Also, too, I forgot to mention as well in our second objective, sorry about that, we, working with partner communities to understand the issues around homelessness, we've done this by building working relationships with municipal governments and service organizations. So our project is carried out in 3 phases. Our first phase is that we conducted a media analysis, so that involves, I thought Halloween was Monday, and anyway. We conducted a media analysis, so what we did was that I wasn't part of that part of the project, but looking at discursive trends in local news outlets and social media posts. We found that, for example, I believe in 2 of the cities, there were Facebook groups.
All 3 cities have them, but yeah,
Yeah.
2 of them were especially active.
Yeah, there was especially active Facebook groups that were very, very anti-homeless. And so we had a research assistant go in and sort of collect data and did an analysis of that. And we also did an environmental scan, and this is just, looking at how each of the cities in our study responded to homelessness and looking at their differences in policy, but also considering kind of the economic and political context that differ in each city as well. Our current phase right now, the one with the big purple circle, that's where we're at right now. We have actually conducted interviews with community stakeholders and analyzed our findings. We're also in the process of sharing our preliminary findings with our partner communities. Back in September, we hosted a workshop that brought together scholars, service providers, law enforcement officers. I believe there was 1 law enforcement officer there, and lived experts to discuss challenges facing mid-sized cities in addressing homelessness. And so we're at that stage right now. And our third and final stage is we intend to host broker dialogues with different stakeholders. This includes people experiencing homelessness, law enforcement, and community members. The broker dialogue occurs in a succession of rounds where community stakeholders record their respective on topics related to homelessness, and this is shared with other community members to cultivate conversations on contentious issues and understand different perspectives related to homelessness in their community. Next slide, please. So we, in total, with all the 3 cities, we have a sample population of 86 participants. We interviewed people experiencing homelessness, service providers, community organizations, and first responders. So that includes police officers, bylaw officers, and firefighters. No paramedics, unfortunately. Not that I know of, no, okay. All of whom residing in the 3 cities. We did our interviews at the height of the pandemic, so doing face-to-face interviews was absolutely impossible. So to help invite people experiencing homelessness to an interview, we partnered with service organizations in the 3 cities to promote the project and organize interview dates and times. Just want to give a huge shout out to those service organizations. They were absolutely essential to our project, and we are eternally grateful to them. I don't know if we were able to pull off this research without their assistance, so thank you so much. All the interviews were conducted online. We used either Zoom or Teams. We're over the telephone for about 1 hour. People experiencing homelessness received an honorarium and what we also called a bundle of care. So it was a package that had socks, hand warmers, coffee, soup, and other essential items. And the service organizations that we partnered with gave the participants the honorarium and the bundle of care. The interviews were semi-structured and asked the participants to share their experiences interacting with people experiencing homelessness in their community, interacting with service organizations, law enforcement, and other community members. We had different interview guides for different populations. For those who are experiencing homelessness, we did get them to invite them to talk about their experiences of their experiences facing social exclusion in their community, either from other community members, through law enforcement, or in their interactions with service organizations. And I think I'm going to pass this on to Erin. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. I wrote everything down because Allison is the moderator and I'm scared of her. So I'm going to read this more than maybe I typically would. Next slide, please. So I have the honor of sharing with you some of our preliminary findings. So this is definitely early stages of us doing the analysis. But I wanted to give folks a sense of where we're at and where our thinking is. And I'm really open to feedback if you're seeing other things and picking out other things that maybe we haven't picked out. So the first finding that I'd like to talk to you about is this idea about public space and how public space is being managed. And when we're talking about managing public space, in reality, we're actually talking about managing people. So when we're thinking about how these mid-sized communities are managing, things like sidewalks, parks, and really the downtown as a whole, right? So when they're looking at their downtown strategy, we're talking about regulating people. And there is what I'm calling a hyper-awareness of homelessness in these mid-sized cities, which have relatively small, compact downtown areas where there is less pedestrian traffic than, say, large urban centers like here in Toronto. And they've had less downtown traffic during COVID, and as they've been working towards revitalization efforts to rebuild their downtown. And so I am going to go off script, and we'll see if I make my time. One of the things that I've really noticed is I've almost wanted, and this is a terrible thing to say, but anyways, I'm going to share with you all. But I've almost wanted, there is an indifference to people who are homeless on the streets of downtown Toronto. People don't give them a second look. And that's a terrible thing, but I'm almost wanting that in these mid-sized cities because at least they leave them alone as they're walking by. Whereas in these mid-sized cities, we're seeing harassment and we're seeing a level of violence because they're so noticed, and there isn't this indifference to them in these spaces. So there's a sense that visible homelessness does not belong in these mid-sized downtown spaces. So this leads some community members to reach out to their municipality, to reach out to bylaw or police, sometimes park departments, to make complaints. And so it was clear in almost all instances where people who are homeless were displaced that it was reactive. It was driven by a specific complaint rather than law enforcement proactively seeking out people who are homeless. And so this never-ending cycle of moving people who are homeless from one space to another means that there are always new complaints, because once they move on to another space, then there's a complaint about that, and it keeps going. In one of our communities, they actually identified a serial complainer. There was a couple serial complainers who make it their mission to call in complaints about unhoused people, who will literally drive around looking for encampments or looking for spaces, and to keep calling in and complaining. So people are being made to move along, sometimes multiple times a day, every day. They are unable to simply exist in public space. Next slide, please. Because of this cycle of complaints, we see the criminalization of homelessness. So this looks like a range of responses, from having private security monitor the downtown, to law enforcement involvement in displacement and evictions, to potential arrest. I'm sure it's no surprise to anybody in this room that people who are homeless are met with the heavy hand of the law. But there's nuance here that I want to explore, and I think we have an opportunity to think about things a little bit differently that I want to highlight. First is that most of the people that we spoke with who are homeless acknowledged that law enforcement don't want to be displacing people and are obliged to respond to complaints. So really, the folks who are homeless that we spoke to identified the complainers, the community members, as the source of the problem, more so than I think what I originally thought, which would be assuming that they would think it's the police. Some people spoke about positive interactions that they've had with law enforcement, but as the quote here that you see shows, most people also had stories of specific officers and or specific instances where they experienced harassment. The other point that this quote highlights is the impact of criminalization over the long term. We know that when people who are homeless are continually displaced, evicted, and moved along, it makes it harder to access services, it breaks up community and safety, and people lose their belongings. And all of this makes it harder to exit homelessness. On the flip side, this person in this quote here, who has been homeless for a decade, has seen the impact of this constant shuffling of bodies on law enforcement. So I'm always thinking about what the impact on people who are homeless. This person who's homeless thought about, well, what's the impact on it's not always police, it's often bylaw. So they say, as you'll see here, some of them, law enforcement, get so fed up with this happening, the daily moving along, get so fed up with this happening every day that they start changing as well. That's what I don't like. So this person identifies the resentment that builds among law enforcement who encounter the same people again and again, who have nowhere else to go, which can lead to even more harassment. So this is really a systems failure that we're seeing here play out in real people's lives. Criminalization begets criminalization. Next slide, please. At the root of so many of the conversations that we've been having with people was really a lamenting of how things used to be in their mid-sized city, hearkening back to a time supposedly when visible homelessness didn't exist in their small community. And so this was actually also true of people who are homeless, who often spoke about new faces and not knowing everyone who was homeless in their community. This fictional account of how things used to be, and the suggestion that these no longer small towns could return to a time when they don't have to bear witness to homelessness, is a narrative that needs to be broken if we're going to see momentum towards preventing and ending homelessness in these communities. And so I think that the service provider said it so well. They say, well, I think some people just want their small town back. They want their utopia. They want their picture of what a small town should be and what a community should be. It should be very black and white and pristine. And maybe it wasn't that. So some community members use this idea that they belong to a community where everyone is supposed to know everyone else's name as a way to suggest that people who are homeless couldn't possibly be from their community, even though the data that we have clearly states otherwise, that most people are from the communities that they're in. This reimagining of a community that never truly existed, and one that didn't exist in this space and time under this political and economic regime, does a disservice to meaningfully addressing homelessness. This goalpost of returning to that time and space is a figment of our collective imagination. Please speak in the microphone.
Does it work? Yeah. It doesn't work. Oh, shoot. I'm sorry, people online. It was just really in my face, and it was kind of annoying. Sorry. Okay. Next slide, please. Last slide. Nope. Yep, there we go. Okay. I don't even know where the person, oh, there you go. Hi. Sorry, I was like, I don't know where this magic person is. So homeless has always been a part of these communities, and in the context of the pandemic and increasing structural barriers, it's on the rise. Mid-sized cities need to shift their work from a criminalized reactionary response to homelessness to a preventative model, one that actualizes their continued mid-sized identity of this tight-knit community. Let's use that idea of a tight-knit community to actually include people who are homeless. So we're still working away on making actionable some of the tools that we've been collaborating with other folks on. But briefly, we've identified 4 themes emerging from the interviews that mid-sized communities can build on as they rewrite the narrative on homelessness. The first is to create targeted communication strategies that reaches specific groups, including business owners, city councilors, and housed community members. Second is to invest in, develop, and provide ongoing funding to outreach supports so that there is an alternative to calling the police when a community member sees someone in need. And I should have added that we don't see those outreach services as including police. Number 3 is to make sure that policies, regulations, and strategies
including informal practices, because that's actually what we're seeing is most of this stuff isn't written down, and so which is what people are doing in practice. Adhere to the human right to housing, and the shift has helpful resources to this end. And finally, to make social inclusion part of municipal plans to prevent and end homelessness. A roof over someone's head is key, but so too is making sure that they have meaningful community that they belong to that can help them stay stably housed, which is the fifth in the typology of the prevention framework. Thank you so much.
So that was awesome. Thank you so much. I am so glad we're on a panel together. I think we need to maybe have a sharing circle or strategizing group or something. You will notice our PowerPoint is not very good. Microsoft actually chose this motif for me, and I thought it was so incongruous with the topic that we were talking about that I needed to just go with it. So we have this like disco motif, and we're gonna talk about the politics of preventing homelessness. I'm Naomi, this is Sarah. So homelessness makes, I'm gonna be terrible at this, thank you. Homelessness makes young people vulnerable to premature death. So it is reasonable and right for us to prevent it. But beyond a general agreement that homelessness is a problem that we should seek to avoid, precisely what is to be prevented, tenting, emergency shelter use, and or street involvement perhaps, and how to prevent it remains contested. This is because prevention is a political and values-laden project, as well as being a scientific and a technocratic one. Today, we will use the politics of prevention as a conceptual lens through which to examine Ontario's data-driven strategies for preventing and ending homelessness. And in doing so, we are inspired by the work of Eric Michalowski and Martin French, who use the politics of prevention as an orienting device in their own analysis of public health responses to the COVID-19 pandemic. Following a similar path, our presentation will explore the tensions that are internal to the project of youth homelessness prevention as these tensions come into view in the day-to-day functioning of coordinated access systems and the management of by name lists, which are how coordinated access systems are functioning, especially here in Ontario. This presentation is based on the results of the first year of a larger project, investigating the data processes and data infrastructure that are currently at work or use in Ontario's youth homelessness serving system. And as part of a larger program of research through which several teams in the Research for Social Change lab are investigating the implementation of new socio-technical relations in the public sphere, seeking to assess how well they serve people who are vulnerable to or experiencing housing precarity and homelessness. It builds on some of my earlier research about how to change policies, programs, and procedures in organizations and in institutions so that they are better able to meet young people's needs and help them live the kinds of lives that they want to live. It gets its inspiration from two participatory projects that I led in Ontario and Quebec, which illuminated how processes for generating and using evidence in institutions tend to serve the interests and advance the agendas of these institutions, and not the interests and everyday people trying to hold these institutions accountable or make sure their rights are upheld. While I was finishing a book about these projects, I was reading Automating Inequality, which if you haven't read it, you should read. It's a book that demonstrates how the move to data-driven policy and decision-making is increasing the surveillance of already highly surveilled groups without actually improving their access to or the qualities of the services that they're receiving. This was in 2018, which many of you will recall was around the same time that Canada implemented the Reaching Home strategy to address the mounting housing and homelessness crisis, indicating a plan to implement many of the same data-driven processes that research was already starting to show were problematic. Thus, I came to my current work with a set of curiosities about whether emerging institutional data practices in public sector institutions would indeed serve the interests of those who depend on these institutions for their material and political well-being. The project we're going to talk about today is one component of a larger institutional ethnography, then, of public sector policy, knowledge, and technology. We are interested in people's experiences developing, implementing, overseeing, contributing to, using, reviewing, and otherwise engaging with data processes, data infrastructure, and data outputs pertaining to youth homelessness, because we believe their experiential insights can illuminate something important about the use of information communications technology in social policy and service delivery contexts. Our investigative work, I'm on a new slide. I'm sorry. Our investigative work began with desk research and a series of key informant information gathering interviews in order to first map out the data and policy landscape, shaping and shaped by the provision of youth homelessness services in Ontario and in Canada more broadly. More recently, we've been talking to people, interviewing them, people who are diversely positioned in relation to these socio-technical and socio-legal relations that we first mapped in the earlier parts of the project. So these are frontline youth and shelter workers, data managers, and other municipal staff. We are also interested in the experiences of those who are the targets of contemporary homelessness data systems, that is, young people and adults experiencing homelessness and housing precarity. While we've interviewed more than 50 individuals, 18 years of age and over, and who are experiencing homelessness for a project that's specifically on coordinated access that we're doing locally, in the project that we're going to talk about today, we have yet to directly engage young people and intend to do so in 2023. We've been waiting for COVID to sort of get to a new phase. We've also been doing observational research in agencies across the province. For today, our preliminary analysis and reflections are structured around the concept of the politics of prevention, attending to the internal tensions that are starting to emerge as findings.
So I want to acknowledge at the outset that coordinated access systems and by name lists are not themselves preventative technologies. By definition, people already have to be experiencing homelessness in order to be included on a by name list. And coordinated access systems are in part rationalized on the basis of being able to better prioritize and match people to housing supports, with local prioritization frameworks generally foregrounding experiences of chronic homelessness, or at the very least absolute homelessness in the case of youth. But this isn't to say that the logic of prevention and the political tensions therein are not apparent in how these systems and technologies operate. As I hope we will begin to kind of show and unpack today. So according to Richard Freeman, whose writing on prevention informs the work of Michalowski and French, which serves as our own inspiration, prevention rests on two linked underlying assumptions, and here I quote, the possibility of scientific prediction and the capacity for controlled government intervention in social life. But the knowledge required to adequately predict a future outcome and the procedures used for generating this knowledge are not self-evident nor are they ethically neutral. So coming to enumerate and know a problem is not simply a technical or mathematical undertaking, as I think anyone paying attention to their own community's efforts to do this can attest. Rather, it's fraught with ethical decisions that shape what types of responses are pursued or not. Nor is knowledge guaranteed to be used by those with power to intervene, particularly not in ways, and I quote here from Michalowski and French, that address structural and systemic forms of inequality and injustice. So what does all of this mean in the context of coordinated access systems and by name lists? I think what we're coming to in this research is that as calculative technologies and the data they produce become central to homelessness responses, decision-making, and accounting, knowing more about these data and the practices through which they are produced and used is essential. If we are to hold our institutions accountable to the people who depend on them, we need to understand the data systems that are structuring how they intervene or not in their lives. So much of our work in this project is aimed at doing just that, opening up the kind of figurative black box of coordinated access and by name list management to better understand their functioning on the ground. So we're only about halfway through this project and our findings are still preliminary, as Naomi suggested. But our intent today is really just to name and reflect on some of the internal tensions that we are seeing in the implementation of these systems, specifically as they relate to youth homelessness prevention and the interrelated processes of knowing or predicting and intervening that underlie the project of prevention as a whole. And I'll go to a new slide here. Thank you. So all housing service managers in Ontario are now required to have an operational by name list, so a list of all known and consenting people in a community experiencing homelessness. In some municipalities, this list is used as the basis for developing by name priority list, which is ranked based on locally defined service prioritization measures. So if you're chronically homeless, comorbid adults, or youth. The by name list and the by name priority list are described as real-time data and framed as essential to the coordination of local resources through coordinated access. That is the federally mandated mechanism for matching people experiencing homelessness to appropriate housing resources. Unfortunately, the singular focus on monitoring person-level homelessness does not enable primary homelessness prevention, given that the people on the BNL are already homeless. For youth in particular, the situation is more complicated. For the most part, frontline workers within youth homelessness serving organizations are attempting to divert youth from shelter, where they would typically be entered into a community's by name list, and in some cases trying to keep them out of these data systems altogether. As we heard from one youth diversion program coordinator, if I could go to the next slide, currently, if the youth situation is resolved within those 14 days, they are not added onto the by name list because we are not recording any information in HIFIS, unless they pop back up again, and then it's a bit of a different situation. But I'm trying to keep folks out of systems that they don't necessarily need to be involved in if that light touch support is all that is needed. Frontline workers positioned in adjacent fields, for instance, mental health, further spoke about the fact that while the majority of their caseload is comprised of youth who are experiencing some form of housing instability, they're only able to get those youth added to the by name list after their housing situation has deteriorated precipitously. And I'll go to the next slide. Like, I'm thinking of a youth I met yesterday who's now in safe beds, and that's like a 2 to 5 day stay. That's all they get there, right? Anyway, like, the insecurity has been there for years, and we've been trying to get them on lists for years, and they haven't qualified for those, but we've known that it's an issue, and there's no way for me to mark that. They've been working with someone at the local youth shelter for years as well. It's just that they haven't been able to get on the list. They are now. Well, there are no doubt some technical and procedural fixes that could help here, and these communities are implementing those. What we're kind of looking to point out right now in our work is just that we see a more fundamental tension here between the ethics of frontline work, meeting people where they're at, not over collecting information, providing light touch supports, and the technology of the by name list as it purports to provide an accurate picture of the current experience of homelessness in a community. And I'll move on to the next slide. Well, there is potential for coordinated access to enable secondary and tertiary homelessness prevention. In our current context, this potential is largely constrained by a lack of available resources, which I'm sure are not a surprise to anyone here. Indeed, while the federal government positions coordinated access as a process that streamlines access to resources in a community, doing away with complicated referral processes, people having to relay their story multiple times, in our current context, it has largely become an exercise in managing scarcity. As we heard from one data manager, go to the next slide. The purpose of the by name list is to connect people experiencing homelessness to certain resources that we have that can only be accessed by people who are experiencing homelessness and seeking housing. So that would be certain housing programs. Those housing and programs are only filled by people who have been added to the by name list. And that's basically to help ensure we're helping people in our community who need it the absolute most. So in this sense, coordinated access and by name priority lists that are meant to make the process data-driven and rational institutionalize a logic of scarcity. And though we did hear from some of our participants about the utility of a by name priority list in supporting collaborative case conferencing within a coordinated access system, such utility relies on the availability of housing and other resources. So in this context, the matching is really limited, as we heard from one service manager, and you can go to the next. I think obviously we need to work together as an integrated system. We also need to work together to evaluate what we're doing if it turns out that the specific tools that we're using or mechanisms aren't achieving the outcomes that we want. And we also have to look out for potential harm that could be coming or just being missed and disadvantaged. So attempting to do that as a community. At the same time, though, we can be as integrated and sort of smooth in our processes, but if the housing is not there, it's not going to make any difference. So rather than addressing the market-based drivers of our current housing affordability crisis, a global phenomenon which is neither natural nor unavoidable, coordinated access promises governments a mechanism for transparently and fairly distributing insufficient resources to a growing number of individuals in need. Here we see not a failure of knowing, but a failure of government intervention. As one frontline youth worker bluntly stated, right now in our city, we're looking at room rentals that are anywhere between $800, $900, $1,000 a month for a room rental. And if you're a youth who's transitioning out of CAS and your next step is, because you don't have employment or you haven't learned those skills to obtain employment, you're going on Ontario Works. When you only get 7-something for Ontario Works, how the heck are you supposed to afford $800 for a room rental? It's impossible. And maybe here I'll turn it over to Naomi.
So for those who may require more complex support, the situation is even worse. Matching is not just about prioritizing those who are most vulnerable to the health diminishing effects of homelessness. It's also the case that available resources, in most cases rent subsidies, may not be suitable nor sufficient for the individuals the community has prioritized for housing. So for example, chronically homeless older adults. It is also commonly the case that there are vastly insufficient housing resources reserved for specific groups that have been named as priorities, like young people. In the meantime, homelessness is eroding people's health, their relationships, their faith in public institutions. And so when they are finally housed in suitable resources, people can not be transitioned out because they have reached a point in a life where the experience of homelessness itself, which we said we won't address until you've been homeless for a year, has so very profoundly eroded every aspect of their life that is stabilizing that they're going to require supports for the rest of their life in some cases. And so communities are now struggling to have a continually growing supply of permanent supportive housing resources. Next slide. But there are also things that people are doing despite these constraints that demonstrate their creativity and continued dedication. Despite the limitations we brought into light here, most of the people we interviewed who work with those experiencing precarity and homelessness are keen to do more strategic and impactful things with data to prevent and end homelessness, including data-driven advocacy and systems monitoring. As such, we leave you with this creative example shared by a Reaching Home funded lead who used data to advocate for youth to be able to access rent subsidies so that they could be diverted from the homelessness system entirely. So this is a use of data that enables a primary prevention approach. And then I think the other thing, as I was mentioning, just around the rent subsidies, we've been able to use program-specific data. For example, one of the intake questions is around where youth are coming from before they landed in needing to access shelter. So many youth have been couch surfing for like an extended period of time, and we've been able to use that to advocate for being able to access rent subsidies within the program, for example. This is one of those ways that we've been able to link the data to hopefully be a useful resource for folks. If we're truly committed to preventing young people from experiencing homelessness, then we need strategies, data-driven or otherwise, that effectively divert youth from the homelessness system with all the supports that they will need to thrive into adulthood. You can do the next slide, which we're not going to do, but I'll leave you wondering what was on that one. It was so important. And just go right to the conclusion because we're almost out of time. And I don't want to get in trouble either. So next one. Haha. Okay, so in this presentation, we have used the politics of prevention as a conceptual lens through which to examine Ontario's data-driven strategies for preventing and ending youth homelessness. Part of the problem, as we have indicated, is the lack of government attention to the systemic drivers of homelessness, which undermine the efficacy of the tools governments have mandated municipalities and employ. It also entrenches a logic of scarcity within the homelessness response system. Scarcity is the preeminent governing rationality that underpins coordinated access as a technical and ethical solution to a growing gap between local housing resources and people's rights to housing. As a rationality, scarcity normalizes individualism, competition, and the material deprivation that results. It naturalizes homelessness as a sad but fair and unavoidable outcome of our global political economic system. Disentangling the current response from the logic of scarcity might open up possibilities for actualizing the right to housing, not as an aspirational vision, but as a pragmatic solution to the current state of emergency. Thank you.
Thanks. So we can go to the next slide. Thanks. So hi, I'm Rebecca, and this is Violet. So today we'll be sharing some ideas and tools to assist housing first providers gain community acceptance for supportive housing when developing new housing. So Violet's organization, Island Crisis Care Society, has had some recent experiences with developing supportive housing where there was significant community opposition. And Violet will share some of the challenges her organization faced with achieving community acceptance, the mitigation strategies they used, and the lessons learned from those experiences. I work at BC Housing's Research Centre, and we've developed several tools to help nonprofit housing providers we fund achieve community acceptance when developing and operating supportive housing. I'll share these tools, and perhaps some of them could be helpful in your area or perhaps even be replicated for your local context. Go to the next slide, thanks. So we'll talk about our organizations. We'll, if we have time, do a little bit of a discussion. We'll talk about challenges, mitigation strategies, and lessons learned, and then we'll go to the tools for community acceptance. Thanks. So first I'll tell you a little bit about BC Housing. BC Housing develops and administers a wide range of housing programs, as well as licensing residential builders and consumer protections for homeowners. We assist 115,000 households in almost 300 communities across BC, with assistance including emergency shelters and homeless outreach, including 14,000 congregate supportive housing units and almost 4,000 rent supplements with outreach supports. We have temporary and permanent housing for women and children fleeing violence, and we have independent subsidized housing, as well as rent assistance in the private rental market, and home adaptations for seniors and people with disabilities, as well as first-time homeowners. So one of our over 800 nonprofit housing providers in BC that BC Housing funds is Island Crisis Care Society. So ICCS operates in several communities on Vancouver Island, and they work with people who have experienced adversity and homelessness, providing housing alternatives and holistic support to their forward development, recovery, and independence. ICCS operates about 70 supportive housing units through 3 sites, offering both. And ICCS also has an overall portfolio that includes 240 spaces, including emergency shelters, transition housing, outreach supports, and other non-market housing. So we wanted to take a second to ask you guys some questions. So before we share our experiences and tools, we'd like to hear about your experiences with developing and operating supportive housing that uses a housing-first approach, including both scattered and congregate housing. So what challenges have you encountered, and what questions or concerns have been raised by neighbors and other community stakeholders? So would anyone like to share some of the concerns you've heard from neighbors? I'll repeat it for people online. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. So for the people online, we've heard that some organizations can get access to capital funding, but it's more difficult to get access to operating funding. Yep.
We had a supportive housing provider in London had the unfortunate experience of opening right before the pandemic, and all of the increased street level homelessness that happened in the downtown core in their area because of the pandemic was attributed to their organization, of course, having opened at that time. So I would say they got the spectrum of questions and concerns of increased drug use, increased loitering, increased crime, everything.
So for people online, we've heard that there was one community where they opened supportive housing just as the pandemic was getting started, and they saw an increase of homelessness at the same time. And the organization that was operating the supportive housing was blamed for the increase in homelessness in the community. And so questions that came up ranged around substance use, crime, loitering. Yes. Yeah, so what we've heard is that there's a high cost for rental housing in the community, and so it can be very difficult for people to access housing, even with rent supplements. And this is especially true for children who are exiting CAS. I hope I got that right. And I saw another hand. Yeah, Erin.
Just coming out of our research, lots of concerns around property value. If they're homeowners, it is that petty crime, so broken window, like literally broken windows theory, but like actually broken windows and broken light bulbs. And really what it's come down for us is people saying, I just don't want to see it. I don't want to look out my window and see it. And that's the hardest one for us to like, yeah.
Okay. So we've heard that there's lots of concern from neighbors around property value. There's concern about petty crime, and there's concern about visibility of homelessness in the community. Yes. So another challenge that we heard was just around the fact that we need to be doing more public awareness and re-education in the wider community so people can understand who's being served in supportive housing. So I think, oh, sorry, there's one more, and then I think I'll have to.
I think there's also that piece around where, like, in some communities it's easier to gain access if the crime population is going to be, like, mostly female identified, rather than if you have to house, like, male youth. So we tend to be more accepting to it, and sometimes as organizations, we also feed into that, right? Because then it is more easier and more acceptable.
So what we heard was that in some communities, there's more acceptance of different client groups being served within the supportive housing. Okay. So thank you so much for all of your comments. So I'm going to turn it over to Violet.
I almost started reading your notes. Well, you could just go on. You're doing such a great job. So I'm here to tell you today about my experience in bringing supportive housing. So this is right on the ground what happened. And it wasn't pretty, let me tell you. So back in 2014, I joined the newly formed Oceanside Task Force on Homelessness, and we started to address some of the gaps in the community. It became evident that there wasn't enough housing, and definitely not enough affordable housing, and people needed more supports than could be provided through the outreach workers who were just doing drop-in support. So education for the community and the municipal councils was started, and we made lots of presentations to groups and started to do that education that we thought was going to be very helpful. We had some success, and we got some agreement from 2 municipalities and the regional district to purchase a piece of land. And so the land was purchased, and we started planning. But then what happened next was quite astounding. I went door to door around the area of the land that we purchased. And I say we, but as I say, it was the municipalities. And I dropped off information sheets and talked to people, trying to get the word out in a positive way. The next slide. Yes, there we go. Community concerns. We started to hear about a petition that was being circulated with incorrect information on it, saying that we were planning an overdose prevention site on the property and many other untruths. The task force put a lot of effort into, we took out 4-page ads in the newspaper, we had information sessions, we did all sorts of things, went to service clubs just to try and get the correct information out. BC Housing planned an information session at a local community centre where we went, and we expected a small group of neighbours to come, but then we got wind that there was going to be hundreds of people. So we quickly moved from one room in this community centre into the bigger room, and we had between 500 and 600 people show up. The next thing we knew, they had set up their own information session, and people were coming in the door and signing what they thought was the sign-in sheet, but it actually was the petition. So when we would make presentations at the city council for the rezoning, I would need security to walk me to and from the vehicle because of the threats that were being made on my life. At one meeting, there were so many residents crowded into the room with placards, and the RCMP removed someone who had hit a supporter over the head with the placard. She resisted being removed and actually bit the RCMP officer. Now, the surprising thing is, this was a 60-year-old woman. She was so passionate about what she believed about what we were going to do to her community that she got arrested and probably has a criminal record now. So the city had to call a public meeting for the rezoning application, and what happened at that meeting was absolutely unbelievable. There were about 500 to 600 people in that meeting also, and the council were all up on the stage. Now what they did is they had, if you were in favour of the project, you stood on one side to go to the microphone, and if you were opposed, you went to the other side. Can you imagine what happened? It went on for about 5 or 6 hours. Everyone wanted to say something, and there was jeering and booing. Anyone said anything positive or had actual research that they wanted to share. It was just unbelievable. And I remember one man, this will always be in my mind, he came up to the front, the no side, and he had a big bucket of needles. And he stood there shaking this bucket of needles, and he said, if this is what our community is going to be like, if you let this project go through, it was just unbelievable. We were going to destroy their community. So it's important to know that all these events were happening 4 years ago, just around the time of the upcoming municipal election. And quickly, the issue became, of course, the supportive housing. I met with one of the people who was out with the petition in the beginning, because he asked me, could he interview me, and he had put the correct information up on the website. So I met with him. You wouldn't believe the lies that he told on the website, things he said I said that I absolutely never would have said. Anyway, that person now, by this point, is running for council, along with every other candidate was running in opposition to this building. They started a GoFundMe page. They raised over $50,000 for legal fees to sue the city. They did. They raised it. So then the next thing that happened is they got in. So the people who now were suing the city were actually the people suing themselves. So they dropped the suit, of course. But then BC Housing came and said, no, we've got a big investment in this. We're building this thing. So they then got in and started working through it. But the election results were very disappointing. Every single member was voted in, and the mayor, every one of them was against the housing. Anyway, we were able to, because it had all been done before, we were able to move forward, and we did get 52 units, supported housing units, but we were supposed to have an 8-bed shelter, and that was stopped. They didn't allow us to do that. Next slide. Okay. So we continued to communicate our plans for the building and how it would be managed. And I want to share with you the most successful type of sessions that we were involved in. Next slide. BC Housing organized some information sessions with a maximum of 25 participants. Neighbors and interested people could register for the sessions that were an hour and a half online. And they were invited to put their questions up front online, so we kind of had an idea of what was going to be asked. They did up a sheet with frequently asked questions for the partners so that we were all saying the same thing. So the purpose of the session was to provide and update the neighbors and stakeholders of Orca Place about when the building will be opening, how it will be operated, seek feedback on the elements of Orca Place, on the CAC terms of reference, and the CAC is a community advisory council that we were going to be setting up, and to give people more opportunity to ask questions and learn more. These meetings were facilitated by a neutral facilitator and were very well structured. Participants sat around round tables with one subject expert, that was someone from BC Housing, from ICCS, Island Health, or the city or task force, and 5 participants. Now, the interesting thing is, when you sit around a table, we had food in the center and drinks. When you sit around a table, it makes a really big difference because suddenly these are people and they know what's happening, right? They hear. I want to tell you about one lady who said to me, "You don't know what it's been like for me." And she's probably about 70 or 80. She said, "You just don't understand." And I said, well, tell me. And she said, "Well, I haven't been able to go to the beach for 6 months." I said, "Why haven't you been able to go to the beach?" And she said, "Because of all the needles." I said, "Have you seen the needles?" "No, but I've heard they're there." So I was able to say to her, "I go to the beach all the time. There's no needles on the beach." But it just goes to show how that fear, when it gets inside someone, I don't know, it's really hard to get beyond that. But when you sit down and actually speak to people, what a difference it makes. Next slide. So what did I learn? No. Is this right? Orca Place, next one. There we go. So what did I learn from all this? Tenacity was what was needed. What was needed to get through, and then once we were able to open the new building, I made sure that whatever I had committed to in those public sessions is what we did. Because I really believe that integrity is important. So if I had promised that we were going to do such and such, that's what we did. And in the summer, we celebrated 3 years since we opened Orca Place, and we now are very well accepted in the community. And I actually had 2 of the newly elected council members call me last week and say, "We love Orca Place. Come before the city and tell us what you need." Over to Rebecca. And we're really short on time.
Okay. So BC Housing's Research Center has created a number of tools to help nonprofit housing providers and other stakeholders achieve community acceptance for supportive housing. So 2 that I would like to share with you in more detail are the community benefits of supportive housing and the community acceptance of non-market housing toolkit. Next slide, please. So BC Housing created the Community Benefits of Supportive Housing tool to address common questions from community stakeholders using established evidence and credible research. The tool uses easy-to-read infographics and questions and answer format to distill long research studies about supportive housing in accessible summaries and messaging that can be used across a variety of audiences, so such as social media, websites, or presentations, or handouts at meetings. So the tool uses a mix of sources, including from government, research, and academia, and all research is cited, and where possible, links are provided so readers can check the methodologies for themselves. And wherever possible, more than one data source is referenced, which serves to validate the research and the points that are made. And while we've tried to focus on BC-specific research, this tool could be replicated in other jurisdictions using local research. So the original tool was published in 2019 and covered questions like, will supportive housing affect property values in my area? Is it costly for taxpayers? Will it change my neighborhood? And will it have an impact on nearby schools? And in 2020, we received a CMHC award for the tool, which came with a grant. And we used the grant to hire a consultant who may be here. Erica, from BC Nonprofit Housing Association, and to find some additional sources to cite in our tool. And so based on the findings of the literature review, we enhanced existing pages and added new topics to the tool. So we added, why does supportive housing allow residents to use addictive substances on site, and how will it contribute to my neighborhood's local economy? And so I'll just give you one example from the toolkit, from the community benefits. A common question raised is supportive housing costly for taxpayers, and why should our taxes go to this purpose? The tool highlights 2 different BC-based studies which come to the same conclusion and validate each other. They demonstrate that supportive housing is a good investment, and that it actually costs more to have people remain homeless than it does to have them than it does to provide them with supportive housing. I'll skip ahead. So go ahead, thanks. So BC Housing also released a toolkit to support those developing non-market housing, build community acceptance. And the strategies in the toolkit build on what we've heard today through ICCS's experiences and in the discussion earlier. So the toolkit has 5 guides. The first guide looks at working with local governments. And the second guide looks at how to prevent and address common site selection and design concerns raised by communities. And the third one provides advice on how to prevent and address community opposition to non-market housing development. And the fourth provides really practical materials and tools for pre-planning and development phases of proposed non-market housing. And it includes media checklists, FAQs, sample letters, and the 5th guide has some additional resources. So we'll go on to the next one. So we have several other tools for community acceptance as well. So on our website, you'll find a resident outcomes evaluation of congregate supportive housing in our rapid response to homelessness program, where supportive housing was developed using modular construction. And we also have a case study series that looks at supportive housing sites that have experienced significant opposition but have since developed positive relationships. And we have done some case studies looking at the impacts of non-market housing, including congregate supportive housing on surrounding property values. And a final report I'd like to draw your attention to is the social and economic return of supportive housing, which includes both congregate and scattered supportive housing. And so this helps to quantify social and economic benefits of supportive housing. So it can be helpful for demonstrating the need and the positive impacts. We'll go to our last slide, thanks. Can we go back one? Yeah, thanks. We encourage you to check out BC Housing's Research Center's library to find community benefits of supportive housing, the toolkit along with other tools that we have there. And you can subscribe to our BC Housing Research Center newsletter to find out when new reports and tools are released. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. You guys are the only group that went over. And not by very much. Not by very much. But you're also the only group who never worked with me. So, and the only group who didn't mention the fear of working with me. So now we have 11 minutes? No, 21 minutes? 21 minutes. I don't know. I work in words, not numbers. We have time for questions. Are there any questions? Please, go ahead.
I think one's a comment, and your experience have been there, right? 3 other lessons. One is get way ahead of the information. With your information. The other is if I throw enough horseshit against the barn door, someone's going to stick, right? And if you got nothing to say, say it loud. So those are good 3 learnings too. The one question that I had, I believe, was the first presenters. I'm very sort of silent here.
Yes. That's stuck. Okay.
I want to make sure I get the right slide. Yours was around people not wanting within their small town.
Yeah.
So my background is children's mental health. We always talk about reframing. Is there a way to reframe the concerns that people express as a way of, we don't know what to do. That scares the hell out of us. We need some direction and help. Is there a chance to kind of look at it that way, as opposed to sort of, it feels a bit condemning?
Do I have to go to the microphone?
Yeah, you should. If you could come to the mic, please, and repeat the question before you answer, I think. And there are people online who are watching, so
Yeah. I have to apologize again for not being in the microphone. I'm feeling very guilty to poor Virtue. So the question was, I'm not going to say it as eloquently as you did, but how can we reframe some of these concerns they have? Sorry, can you say it again?
How can we reframe what people are saying in the community
Yeah.
in small towns in a helpful way?
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So sorry. How can we reframe what people are saying in these smaller communities in a helpful way? And I think that's exactly what we're trying to do. That's what with these projects. I don't know if she's here. Is Sahar here? So, anyways, Sahar was at our workshop a few weeks ago, and she gave this amazing presentation around like how to have these conversations with people who might not agree with you, and like how to like find common ground where there seemingly is no common ground. And I'm stealing Sahar's points here, but she talks about fairness, that everybody's looking for fairness. And so how do you build on that? Okay, if we all want fairness, what does that look like and what does that mean? And so I think that's what we're trying to work with. And then this idea that this small town, this imaginary small town feel is what's stopping people from being empathetic and compassionate. How do we flip that on its head and say, well, if you're a small town that thinks that you help everybody out, well, that actually includes helping out folks who are homeless. So that's exactly what we're trying to do. How to do it is another battle, but yeah, that's great.
I think sometimes you just have to acknowledge people's desire to feel safe.
Yes.
The folks that we support all the time, they want to feel safe. The advocates want to feel safe. These people do too, so how do we engage?
Yeah, so the comment is people just want to feel safe, and that is what we're finding. I was in an encampment a few weeks ago, and a resident, a homeowner across the street came by with everything you can, all the NIMBY rhetoric you can imagine, just came by, and this lived expert who was beside me spent 45 minutes with her and made her do a 180. It was a master class in watching her flip. Went from just get them out of here, I don't want them anywhere near here, to we need to get them more bathrooms. And I was like, what did I just witness? And the lived expert afterwards said, what I did was validate their feelings, validate the fears and the concerns, and then say, well, actually what to do about that, because kicking them out won't work. What to do about that is actually providing housing, really, but all the things we need. So I'm learning that, and I think that's, what we're finding from this project. So thank you so much. That was great.
Okay, I'm going to read an online question. Once someone is living in transitional care, guys, they're removed from the by name list as they're considered to have a fixed address. Even if they're still at imminent risk. So the individual may then fall through the cracks if they lose their space in transitional. There needs to be a better integration and coordination between like agencies. How do we bridge this gap? Yeah. Oh, and that's from Jenna Morin, or Morin, I don't know. Probably Morin, I don't know.
Jenna, that's such a good question, wherever you are. What we noticed were all sorts of instances like this. In one of the communities we were working with, when a person, when they don't know where they are, they mark them as either, and this is one category, dead, housed, or in jail. So the enumeration of who is homeless in a community is not simply a mathematical or technical or statistical exercise. It's complex and it's fraught and influenced by the service scene that people are participating in and the rules related to accessing each of those services, which are different. So this was one of the things that came very starkly into view also about young people who couch surf or are homeless in ways that the by name list may not recognize, or they're not showing up in our service systems in the same way that others will. We don't count them. And so then when the by name list is used, as it is used in my community at every council meeting, to legitimize particular moves by our municipal government to criminalize people who are experiencing homelessness, it is hard to argue that there is a reality of homelessness that list doesn't capture. Also because they hide the list and I have to FOI it when I want to get access to it. It's not a publicly accessible real-time source of data. It's a tool that is being used strategically to advance whatever agenda is coming forward from the city itself. And it's become a site of tension in the community, like high levels of friction as people are trying to continue to work together in this context. I'm not sure I totally answered that person's question, which was so good. But.
I don't know. She'll let us know maybe. There was a question back here. Okay, great. Hands up.
I think just to follow up on that, is that not more of a user error? Like your community is clearly not using their binding list. There's lots of communities who do share that data, and it is accessible, and they're using it. And I know Jenna well. She's from my community, and I know that's kind of what I thought we were going to talk about here was how do you convince communities to use it better. And I don't think it's a problem with the tool itself. The binding list is not supposed to be a prevention tool. It's an intervention tool. So that and it's a data collection tool. If we don't have the data, we can't come up with the prevention tools. So I think like we're throwing the baby out with the bathwater a little bit.
Can you come up here, Naomi? And while you were waiting for you, can you answer the question we've all been wondering? Is it Morin or Morin? Oh, you don't know either? Okay.
Thank you. That's also a good question. We are not throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Our community is actually committed to trying to make this work, and we are working with communities across Ontario in this study, and some are having public data dashboards that allow for different kinds of conversations about who is homeless in the community and different levels of accountability vis-a-vis that information. And so we bring that back and say, hey, there's another way to do it. And this could be helpful in terms of having more transparent and equitable democratic conversations about what's going on and how to address it. Our point today is that this isn't simply a technical fix. And I think that one of the things that communities are telling us that they've been struggling with is the idea that it was offered to people as a suite of services to prevent and end homelessness in their communities, and they're doing all the things. And it's not working in the ways that they had hoped, and in fact is creating political blocks in terms of how people are able to work together, in part because they haven't yet figured out the ways, perhaps, to have an open access list. And Toronto has an open access list often that I've seen that's really useful and accessible. That's not the case everywhere, and we wanted to make sure that this was clear and that this in and of itself was insufficient. In the absence of access to housing, people are working very hard to enumerate a problem, but the intervention required to address it is missing. Yes. Again, to instead of committing to the logic of scarcity, the fact that we don't have enough housing for people, this is not, as I said, it's not natural nor unavoidable, right? We actually could, as a nation state, get behind our commitments to prioritize access to housing for everyone. Like the right to housing we've enshrined in law. It's a universal right. We've actually made a statement as a nation that we are prioritizing housing and the prevention of homelessness for everyone. What we need to actually do is invest in that side of things in ways that we haven't yet, or we continue not to do. We have it, so I think, the point in time count data shows us that we have a problem. Once a year we have this, it is useful. I'm a researcher, I'm a Canada Research Chair. I believe in data and the value of data. What I'm proposing is that is not a simple counting exercise, and that the relationship between knowing and doing is, as your presentation really illuminated for us, fraught with ethical and politically charged things. And so it's not simply a technical fix that is required.
We have 11 minutes left. I know we have at least 3 questions, so we'll start with you, and then you, and then you. Great.
I'm a street worker in Montreal. I also work with not the Montreal Police Force, but the Longueuil Police Force in training the police officers. With your question where the police officers didn't want to move, is there any discussion from the police force about the discretion that they have with the calls that come in, and even intervening with the caller instead of intervening with the presumed
I'm not gonna like do it this way. Okay. Yeah, thank you. The question is about if police say that they don't want to do this work, is there any way to intervene? That's such a good question. It's actually been a key part of this research. The bulk of the interactions that folks who are homeless are telling us that they have are with bylaw more than police. So that's actually where we've ended up focusing a lot of this work. And what bylaw are telling us, both police and bylaw are telling us, that they don't want to do the work, but bylaw specifically has an obligation to respond to every complaint, every 311 call they get or whatever it is. They have to have some sort of reaction. And so they have said that sometimes they'll go and speak to the complaint. If they know the complainant, they go to speak to the complainer and say, like, what can I do? Like, there's nothing I can do. Usually what they're finding is that that's not a sufficient response to the complainer, and then it gets escalated to the police. And so what has ended up coming up over and over again is both police and bylaw. First of all, everything's being downloaded onto bylaw. Like, that's what's happening, is like police don't want to do it, and so they give it to bylaw. Bylaw doesn't want to do it. Sometimes give it to private security, but otherwise there's just nowhere else to like hand the buck to. But so many of them are saying, we don't want to do this. This isn't why I signed up to be I don't know what you signed up to be a police officer. But anyways, this isn't what we signed up for. This isn't what we wanted to do. But then the extension of that, which is, well, so then actually what you need is some of your budget to go towards people who should be doing that work. That's where the line gets drawn. And they're not interested in reallocating funds away from policing to community support.
Jason?
Yeah, just a quick question for the Orca House team. So it seemed like the rabble-rousers had sort of taken over, and then BC Housing came in at the last hour and just kind of pushed things through.
No.
No, is that?
No.
Would you mind standing up or just using one of these if possible?
Thank you.
So the question was, did BC Housing come in at the end?
That's kind of how I interpreted that.
No, so no, that's not right. BC Housing was there throughout the whole process, supporting, because they put, it was $8 million or something into this building, and but I don't think anyone was expecting it to be such a big public outcry. And then what ended up happening, the reason it got through was because the previous council, who was in favor of it, they pushed the rezoning through before they got ousted. So then it was in place, and then there was nothing that could be done other than they had the legal case, and they were fighting that. Then once they got in, they dropped the legal case. But that's when then BC Housing stepped in and said, no, we're going to fight this legal case because we've got $8 million wrapped up in this, and so then they stepped in. So, yeah.
So they hadn't rezoned before they left here?
They had, yes.
They hadn't.
Right, it wouldn't have gone because then the new council would have, we were very fortunate in the timing. Yes, and there's still no shelter in that community and we have a beautiful building with a shelter in it, but we can't use the shelter. So, yeah.
7 minutes left. Colleen and then Rita.
So just on the by name list, I've worked with individuals within a detention center because I worked in the community as well, to get them on the by name list. So a lot of individuals that work within the institutions don't know about the by name list. They're not educated on that. So when they're working on discharge plans, right? Thing is, though, within detention centers, individuals often get discharged to different institutions, provincial, federal, right? And so when you're explaining to an individual, what the by name list is, they think, well, maybe it's just another social housing list, just another list, another list, another list, right? And so I'm just wondering if there's been sort of any research done on that as far as like, what is the follow-up? Okay, after I'm released, well, this social worker at so-and-so, she put me on some list. I don't know what list I'm on, but like, you know what I mean? Is there any, because just the concept of by name list, what does that mean to someone when you're telling them what that is? It's so politically advanced, in my opinion, that doesn't make sense when I'm trying to explain it. And it's so frustrating. I don't know if there's anything around that. Yeah.
I love that. The question was for people who are joining from not here, about people coming out of incarceration, and they may be invited to participate in getting on the by name list, but they may not know what that actually means for their life or what their responsibilities vis-a-vis staying on that list are. People, social workers working with people may also not know those pieces. And this is something else that we learned, and we created a guide that has personas, that explains the matrix, all the different processes if you're homeless, what each thing means. It's for social workers, it's for people experiencing homelessness to demystify this actually complex process. It took 6 months of desk research with a team to figure out how it actually works, because we had to test it out and fact check everything, phoning our centralized intake line and finding out, oh, it doesn't actually work. You can't phone centralized intake. You have to actually phone individual shelters. You can't show up at certain times of day. You can only show up at other times of day. Like mapping all that out for people so it's at fingertips, especially if you're working with someone who's in a state of crisis. You can look through it together and explore options. Because that is another problem in our community where people are spending time in the provincial corrections facilities, and we, as a municipality, the municipal workers are trying to liaise with corrections who won't talk to them, and people are released into homelessness quite regularly in our community, and then the work starts again. And so if there could be actually in-reach to the jail to coordinate getting on the list even in advance of when a potential release might come so that they're met with housing on their way out, this would be a huge possibility for preventing some cyclical patterns of people's kind of moving between jail and the streets. There was something else about that I wanted to say, but I forget.
Yes, let's give Rita the last question.
Mine might be more of a comment and more like knowledge sharing. When it comes to the binding list, one of the challenges that I experience within the shelter is when someone has left and you get a list and your name is on there, often because it's a 3 months, right? You just have to enter the homeless system within that, or response within that 3-month period, and that's what the list consists of. But the challenge has really been the same way the city is really on outputs. Within the shelter systems, we also have that pressure to be on outputs, right? So when you get the list, and like I was saying to my housing workers, you can still call that person, even though they're not here. Like they may have moved, usually it's in regards to subsidized housing. So they may have moved into a market rental place, or they may have moved into transitional housing, but their name has shown up, right? So you should call that person and actually say like, hey, there is permanent housing that has come up for you. But often the workers are very focused on the clients that are still at the shelter. So the person might be at the top of the list, but they're like, oh, no, they got housing. We just want to, let someone who's here. And so that's one of my critiques of it. And then the other piece is also around, even if a client just got a place and they haven't left yet, and then the by name list comes and their name is on it, and this is an opportunity to give them permanent housing. The same thing. Well, we got them a place, they're getting ready to move, and it's like, no, it's market rental, they're renting. So there's also that challenge, and I always wondered, is it because, workers or people are thinking the by name list, they have to physically be in the shelter, and you're not understanding that it's actually that 3-month period, and they don't need to be here as long as their name is on the list, and it's still their right to be offered that place in terms of prevention, right? Homelessness prevention.
I'm sorry, we're out of time. Thank you, Rita. Thank you to our presenters. Thank you to all of you for choosing to come to this session. I want to remind everyone that the welcome reception is happening in Ballroom B. If you were not going, please come see me to give me your drink ticket. Otherwise, I'll see you there. Thank you.